Hello everyone. Just going to give you a quick little bit of whole class feedback on key assessment 9 on who's got power in Doll's House. A few quick thoughts to maybe help you understand what an A grade answer might have in it. So I've learned plenty from what people wrote. On the whole, answers I think were very solid, very sound. So I was giving away lots of C grade, lots of B grades. So obviously we need to look closely at the dynamic between Helmer and Nora, which is very key. Lots of people had a sensible structure, looking at the beginning of the play, what kind of situation do we have at the start, comparing that with the end. I thought tracking through the play worked really well here, to see how those relationships develop. So obviously, I think we'd want to be using the animal-like language to describe Nora at the beginning. Better answers dug a little bit into the connotations of those words. So weaker answers were saying she's dehumanized by this language. Okay, that's fine. But if we start to look at what kind of language words Ibsen chooses to describe Nora, so we've got things like skylark and songbird. Now, as soon as you've got that songbird, you've got the connotation or the implication of the caged bird, which is there for the entertainment of others, of a nature which is confined. Now, that would be worth using to build the idea of Helmer's power, because he's got the key to the cage. A skylark, again, a small bird which is fragile, which is weak, which is not physically strong. But there is a connotation there, I think, of something which is freer, which should be part of nature, which is wild. So I think to some extent that foreshadows her escape and liberation at the end of the play. So we wouldn't need to make all of these points, but something about the connotations would be helpful there, I think. Um, if we're looking at Helmer, some people were making some very interesting points about he's less free than he seems because he's a prisoner of middle class conventionality, of conformity. I thought those points were well made. They needed evidence. So some people were using the evidence of his tastefully furnished room, so he's fitting into ideas of middle class taste. I thought that was a good idea. Um, we can start to make some patterns and links in the play by looking at maybe the power that different men have. So we could look at Helmer and Krogstad, for instance. Not many people did this, but it's a way to add value. We could think about, okay, in what ways is Helmer and Krogstad's power similar? Both men, both masculine. They both do use a patriarchal power to dominate Nora. And we could look at their language and look at how it kind of has some similarities to it, in its kind of fairly brutal, certainly in Krogstad's case, control of her. And yet at the same time, there is this facade of manners, I think, in both of them. With Krogstad, it's courtesy. And then with Helmer, there's this more kind of teasing, playful quality, which the better answers identified. So his power is kind of softened a little bit, or perhaps even disguised. So it's made to seem something of a game, which, again, people noted that Nora collaborates in, and she plays a part in this game. Which was so there we can develop some strength. However, clearly Krogstad and Helmer are very different in many ways, largely because of social class. So if we flip there from a patriarchal analysis of the play to a more what you might even call a Marxist analysis based on social class, there are opposite ends of that class structure, and then Krogstad is desperately under the control of Helmer. And we can see that through the whole dismissing of him because of the using his first name, and that's too familiar, and therefore Helmer feels threatened. Okay, so how does this then develop? Clearly, Krogstad then acquires this power because of knowledge about what Nora's done and his legal understanding of it. So it's worth dwelling there, I think, a little bit on this new kind of power that's appeared. It's kind of a villainous power. Reminds me a little bit of Iago and the way that he challenges orthodox power with something which is more anarchic and more dangerous to the status quo. Um, so I think people did notice Krogstad's power, but we could have described that a little bit more crisply, a little bit more precisely. Um, I think the idea of eroticism is very interesting with Nora. Most people noted it, that she has this some sort of control or power or influence over her husband because of her physical attractiveness. Um, some people did that well, some people did it a little bit more basically. Very worth looking at the Tarantella, I think, as a specific dramatic moment in the play. We can look at that as a kind of a losing of control and hence of power of Nora. I think she kind of dances herself into a frenzy, but I don't quite really like that personal interpretation personally so much. I prefer an idea that this is a strategy by Nora, and she knows exactly what she's doing, and she has specific goals here. She wants to delay Helmer opening the box, his letter box, so we can make nice crisp references to the detail of the play. Exactly what is it that Nora wants? Exactly what is she doing to achieve it? And it works. It's temporary, it's limited. We can say that in terms of the power. You know, she's not in charge here, but she can control in the moment Helmer. And yet, what a lot of people missed, I think, was that there is a question mark over that at the after the dance, because Helmer starts to make unwanted advances upon Nora. And this is a place where I think production could be quite interesting, the way that it's performed. So, is this a giggly kind of playful moment between two people who are drunk, or is there something darker and more threatening? In other words, a threat of rape. I thought the Young Vic production that we watched, it was kind of balanced. It was kind of in the middle. It was clear that Nora didn't want this. It was also clear that she wasn't too terrified by it, and she seemed reasonably confident that she could deal with it. So I thought that was kind of nicely ambiguous, nicely judged. You can imagine how different productions could shift that in different ways. So that would be nice for context, for different interpretations. So yeah, the idea of her erotic power is kind of a double-edged sword for Nora. It's useful, but then it kind of gets turned against her. And I thought, in terms of patriarchy and especially, post Me Too, very interesting issues to look at potentially there. Okay, if we look at the final moment, this is where Nora, I think, takes on a potential claim to the most powerful character. Why? It's that the door slam, isn't it? Her walking out of this doll's house, out of the cage which she has been, the songbird which is trapped in. We can link back then to that imagery at the beginning of the play to make connections, to again strengthen answers. And for me, the really essential issue here is the dramatic power of it. It's incredibly powerful for the audience in sat there in that theatre. Our attention is riveted. This challenges our notions of what is acceptable for a woman. A lot of people noted that Victorians would be horrified. Generally, I think that was a little bit crudely done. We have to acknowledge that times were changing. Ibsen was part of that change. There would be other people watching this play, reading it, who would be sympathetic to that. So it's creating a debate in Ibsen's society here, and there'll be different opinions about it. And you can see that in the critics at the time. So an opinion on that which is based on knowledge, which is based on reading and research, rather than just an idea that women would be condemned as rightfully the creatures of their husbands. It's not untrue, but it's rather limited, and it's not based on thorough research. So that was a limiting factor with some people. But yeah, if I come back to this idea that this is what gives this moment its charge, really, in the theatre. Nora walking out like that is so unexpected that she kind of controls the audience. She has a power over us, which will be a nice, neat, stylish final move to make. So we think about who's got power in the family. Okay, so starts off being Helmer. At the end, Well, he's left with the kids, he's left with the nanny, etc. But we don't really feel his power, we feel his helplessness. So we need to pay close attention to the dramatic effect which Ibsen is creating. On the other hand, if we stop and think about it, Nora is disappearing into a very uncertain and fragile life. So her power becomes, in an objective sense, quite ambiguous. But theatrically, subjectively for that audience, we feel her complete control. And we feel that clearly through her language, through that physical action of walking through that door, through her long, controlled, mature sentences compared to Helmer's bewilderment, his fragmented language, his bafflement, really. So there's a real inversion there. And good answers really go into the detail of how Ibsen constructs our impression of how power has changed utterly between those two people. In the wider society, yeah, Helmer's still the bank manager. So when it says who's got power in the play, well, there's different ways we can look at that. Who's got power within the house, the microcosm? Who's got power in that wider society? Arguably, still Helmer. But Ibsen does not foreground that idea of his professional power. It's not what our dramatic focus is directed towards. We are directed towards Nora's control over herself and her control in this relationship. So I saw a lot of people in the conclusion struggling about how do I make a decision, because everybody's got an argument for power here. Krogstad definitely has. Helmer, we've seen, is a little bit ambiguous at the end. That means that Nora's power is a bit ambiguous at the end. Some people, I think Jade, for instance, was saying that Mrs. Linda is actually dramatically the most powerful character because it's her control over Krogstad and her influence over her to determine what he does with that letter, which changes everything. I thought that was a really neat idea. Plot-wise, you can argue it, but I think in terms of dramatic effect, the way that we perceive it as an audience, I don't feel that we quite kind of feel that. But Jade really got credit for that because it was a well-structured, logical argument, so which was nice to see, a little bit of independent thinking. But yeah, I think at the end of the day, it's sort of what we as an audience feel at the end of this play. For me, which should direct the conclusion. And because Nora has power over us and an audience, for me, Nora wins. There are other A-grade answers that you can come up with. Krogstad, you could argue. Helmer, you could argue. Actually, despite this, in social terms, he still has power. Even as we've seen Mrs. Linda. But yeah, a crisp conclusion is quite nice, really, which is argued from a sensible base of evidence. So those are my thoughts. Really enjoyed your writing. Well done. Thanks for listening.